Hello and welcome to Writing with Sophie, Top 3 Takeaways, where education and business influencers discuss teaching, writing, and communications online, in a classroom, and at home. Sitting in silence next to me today is Sophie, the video star of my Writing with Sophie ebook series. Check it out. Today I have on the phone Kimberly Green. She is originally from New Jersey and moved to North Carolina in 2009 for a position at Morgan Stanley. She is also a small business owner of Creations by Kimberly, a small crochet business with signature pieces she sells at holiday bazaars and also online, and I will post her website below the podcast. She also has her own band and performs all genres of music, as well as performing with other bands. And she has performed in a few off-Broadway plays. In 2015, and this is where our journey together begins, Kim decided that it was time for her to pursue her dream of getting a college degree. In 2018, she completed her associate's degree in business administration with a concentration in management, and in 2019 completed her BA in HR management, and congratulations on those degrees. She is currently in the process of studying for securities licenses for investment banking. Kimberly's motto is, if nothing changes, nothing changes. Nothing stops Kimberly Green from being successful. And I know this firsthand. And welcome to the program, Kimberly.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And although I was a little nervous, there's really nothing to be nervous about.
No, there's not. We've had many conversations. I had the great honor of having Kimberly Green in my class, my writing class. That's where our story and your journey, well, part of your journey as a writer began. So I would love to start with hearing about your journey as a writer, and also how do you use writing now?
I do write at work, and like when it comes to, of course, sending emails, not just for work, but for my business and stuff like that. But the teaching that I learned really enlightened me, and really, I think it shined a light on how much I didn't know about writing, contextually, just simple things like formatting the material, how you go about introducing your subject to your reader. It was really, really important, especially when I had you as a teacher. Initially, I had your first class online, and I was really, really scared. But since I was young, I always had a challenge in my English classes, really just understanding what I read. And maybe I get things right or wrong, but I just never understood. And when it came to the writing aspect, it was the same thing. You wrote what you thought it was or what you thought it could be, or, writing a small essay. And not that it was wrong, it's just that I didn't know the correct way to do it. And that transitioned over 30 years later of me going to college, it transitioned over and it was the same thing. So when I took your class and learned how to really present to my audience, if that makes sense. And
Total sense.
As I further went on, I took the second class, which was not just about writing, but about the research that goes into what you're going to write, introducing your story or introducing your subject, and then giving it context and how it applies or doesn't apply, and then giving a conclusion. So it always helped me understand that I was not only the writer, but how would someone else read it? How would they interpret it? And so I really did appreciate that.
That is key too in writing, wouldn't you say? I mean, you are reading to.
Oh yeah.
You're writing
totally
to somebody,
agree.
And I think in school,
Yeah.
you get taught that you're reading to a teacher. And what kind of an audience is that? That's the person who grades you. It doesn't give you the opportunity to think, oh, I could actually write something for the paper or an email to somebody. I mean, it's so limited. And you mentioned that you brought with you 30 years later when you returned to school, which in itself is just so marvelous that you had the courage to do that. But you brought your old ideas of how you were not taught to write well with you to the classroom 30 years later. And I'm certain that brought a lot of fear.
Of course, when I took your class and I was very intimidated by it, it really opened my eyes big time. And I understood I've been doing it wrong all along. And, I really was grateful that you were that person that taught me how to look at it differently. Not only that, even when I took the second English class, just as you said, you're writing for the audience. One thing that I really appreciated about the research and writing class is that in that class, every week we took a section of that paper that we had to write and we read it in the class. It allowed you to hear how others perceive the subject that you were writing about. And maybe in your mind it made sense, but listening to the opinions of others as the reader of your paper, it gave you perspective. You know, I was on subject, but this is where it went wrong, and I have to reel it back in, or I have to give it a different approach, or even give it some more research to give it some more context.
I love that
I definitely was appreciative of that.
I love that you brought that up because, Kim, it brought me right back. I could see us in those little circles reading our papers out loud.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so true, is it not, that you have to hear what you have written. That's why I always tell everybody, read your own work out loud. It's great if you can read it to somebody else, but at least hear it, because people take it in. Even when you're reading, you are internally hearing it. It's interesting because, as you know, I've just finished a second ebook on actually how to write an essay, and I'm very lucky because my husband is an incredibly good editor. I write a section or the whole book or whatever, and then we sit down, computer next to computer, and I read out what I've written down, and then inevitably, every passage, he says, well, tell me what you mean. And I tell him, and he says, that's what you need to write down. What is so marvelous about that is I knew when I finally edited the books, oh gosh, I don't know how many times we edited them and wrote them, rewrote them, but I knew it had been heard by somebody else, right? As you said, like you had never really considered reading your work out loud. And when you read it to the class, you realize, oh, I thought I covered that. And they say,
exactly.
Exactly. No, I don't know what you're talking about here. It's just
exactly.
So, and actually, Kim, because you're someone who works in business and you have constantly, impressively been promoted and stayed in a company for a long time. No doubt one of the things that you've had to learn is the type of writing that you do for different people or different companies or different circumstances. The content of the writing has to be so different, and you have to make sure that your tone and how you approach it is different probably in just about every circumstance.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know what's funny about what you just said about reading it out loud? When it's in your mind as you're writing it, listening to it out loud is still two different things. And it sounds weird, but it's so true that you have to really consider the audience and who you're presenting your material to. And to your point about all of the different audiences that you have to write to, you definitely have to switch it, but you still have to be on point with whatever the topic is. And you have to make sure that they understand it and that it's clear and it's understood from the beginning to the end.
And sometimes I know that we used to talk about scheduling out when an assignment is due and leaving time for certain days within the cycle of the writing of it and the rewriting of it and the revising of it, that you have time to let it sit even 24 hours, because sometimes you need to take a break from it to make sure it's right. Wait. WAIT is a big part of your vocabulary as a writer, because sometimes, and I'm sure you know this from your communications, you have to wait. If you think, is this really what I want to say? It's better to wait and think about it and send it later, because I know in the heat of anger about something or something like that, I've sent something off and really regretted it. I love what you said. You are hearing it inside your head, but it is not the same thing as it sounds outside of your head, as crazy as that sounds.
Right.
And actually, since I'm sitting next to Sophie, who only can speak in her head, we think, what do we know? So she's the perfect example of, maybe that's why she hates writing so much, or me bugging her about her writing. So you came into the class and you were in it to win it. That
Yeah.
motto, nothing changes, nothing changes. I mean, that is the way you live your life. And so
Yeah.
I would love to hear you give some advice to students who are trying to learn to write. We'll start with that, but also the fact that you were a returning student and also you had to deal with online. So those were
Hmm.
three enormous pieces. But let's just start with some advice that you want to give to students who are trying to learn to write.
For students that are in a class or just want to learn to write overall, I think you really have to put in the work. I think that, not to get spiritually deep, but I do believe that faith without works is dead. So if you want to write, you really, it's one thing to have faith, but if you don't do any of the work, your faith won't matter at that point. I mean, that's pretty much it. I think you have to put your work in and understanding what you're trying to do, what you're trying to relay, who the audience is, how will your audience hear you,
Yes,
hear what you're trying to say.
that's such amazing advice. And you use the word faith, and whether we take this spiritually or on a secular level, I feel strongly that without a growth mindset as a writer, someone who's willing to say, I'm not there yet, or like what you said, you didn't even realize you didn't know the process of writing. You had just written
Hmm.
things down. You didn't realize, like you said, that there was an introduction, there was research, there was a middle, there was an end, and even the writing
Hmm.
was a process. There's a thesis, a first draft, another draft, a final draft, and editing. It's so easy to do things backwards or just think that you're going to write it down and it should be done. And
Right.
again, you mentioned the audience, but I feel strongly anytime I teach, to me it is equal 50% writing process strategies with growth mindset strategies. I think I used to say to you, because you mentioned this to me recently, Nike, just do it. I mean, you have to
Right.
have faith, because you could have a blank page and then you have nothing. And
Exactly.
I don't care what level you are on. It takes a lot of courage
Right.
to write. I mean, I've been writing my
It really
entire
does.
life and published books and all kinds of things, but still, every time I think, oh, are people going to understand this? And then, when you're a published writer and they don't buy your books, you're like, oh, I'm a loser. So
No, but I understand that. I do understand that. And it's funny that you should say that, because I was listening to your first podcast and you mentioned that, you had wrote an article in the Times, but you didn't tell anybody because you didn't have the confidence. And that's a way different situation to where you are. You understand it on a different level because you wanted it. You didn't have faith and gave them a blank page, but you wanted it. You wanted to learn. That's the business that you're in, writing and teaching writing. But at the time, I'm not sure at the time if you were, but you mentioned that you wrote an article for the Times, and
right, right.
you didn't really want to mention it because you were like, oh my God, you didn't have the confidence. And I think putting in the work over time as you learn, that confidence will eventually, poke its head, and you'll be able to do it better. And as you get better, you'll get better again,
Yes, exactly.
So, I mean, that's great.
And don't you find, Kim, the great news about writing and actually practice, whether you're doing a sport or whatever you're doing? I mean,
Hmm.
you're a crochet artist and you're a singer.
Hmm.
So you didn't
Hmm.
come to be able to sell your crochet wares until you made some horrible stuff and made a lot
Right.
of
No,
errors.
that's true. That's very
I
true.
don't care
Very
what you
true.
do. And for some reason, I think it's because the way writing is taught, you're given an assignment and told, okay, you got 2 weeks, submit it. Now, this isn't the way we would do anything else, right? So unless you have somebody
Right.
who's taking through the steps and showing you how to do it, you're just going to be by yourself thinking, okay, so, and you're thinking out loud, right? And and
Hmm.
people are often send into me stream of consciousness. They're just kind of
Right.
I have to write on how to crochet, and so you just think it out loud and type it up, and you don't think, okay, so
Right.
how does the writer perceive this? I mean, and particularly
Right, exactly.
exactly with the example of crochet, you're an expert now. So you have to back it out. If you're trying to teach me who has never done any crochet, you would have to think
Mhm.
through how could you present it to me, which is where we started at the beginning of this conversation, where you mentioned the importance of audience and you had never really thought about it before, which goes back to a classroom where the teacher is the audience, and that's kind of a made up thing, right? Yes, they're your audience
Right.
for that class, but it doesn't go beyond that. So you did mention in the beginning that you've taken both ground and online classes. And as you know, because of the pandemic, many places, most places really, are starting online. And I know teachers are
Mhm.
struggling, but students are also really struggling. So I was just wondering if you have
Right.
any advice for students who are new to the online world. How can they be successful there if they're nervous about it right now?
If you're nervous about the online world, like I was saying earlier, when I took the first English class with you, it was online, and I was very intimidated because I'm that type of person. If I know that it's a subject that I'm intimidated by, I always want to hold on tight to my teacher, like Linus and his blanket. What I would encourage students to do is if in a class where you're having a struggle, especially with writing, because that's kind of the subject, but it could go for anything else, I would really pull on the resource, the primary resource, which would be my professor, and I would build a rapport with them so they can understand that I'm having an issue. And in order for me to be the best writer I can be, I need your assistance as my professor and or a person that is the subject matter that's teaching me. So that's what I would say to that.
That's great advice. There's always, in learning management systems for online courses, there's always ask a professor or a place to pose a question, and the professors should have their email or whatever their preferred method of communication, which is also really important to figure out what the professor likes to be communicated with. For example, I write in advance to all my students. I send them an email, and I actually use that little video of the New York Times and send it out, and mostly to gather up their phone numbers, because if I need to contact a student or they need to contact me, it's a lot easier in my view that I can text them. But there are many teachers who don't want to be texted. I mean, it just depends on the teacher. So you have to figure out whether it's an email, a phone call, or a text, or it could be that there's a weekly chat or whatever. Particularly for writing, you mentioned reading your work to your classmates in the classroom. If there's the opportunity in a classroom where there's a sharing of writing, or at least in the discussion post, right? Let's say you were writing a thesis and you don't know if it's good, you could share it in there. I think a lot of the classes actually have that.
You know, because we're quarantined, Zoom has become very popular, and I think they also have like a Google video thing, but Zoom has been the most popular thing. Take advantage of that. You know, maybe you can build a rapport with your other classmates, and maybe you guys can put out there, hey, let's do a Zoom chat and let's toss some ideas around, let me read this to you. You guys tell me what you think. I think that's a very great tool to do that,
That's an
to
excellent
to
idea.
help with moving forward, or just help in the process of, I need to get through this. If your teacher's not available, or maybe you sent them an email and they didn't have a chance to get back to you, if you have your classmates there, that can be a help. I would utilize that as well.
Correct. And just like you, I just went back to school. I just got I actually I enrolled in the program I teach in and got it, my digital entrepreneurship MBA. And what I found as a student, which I'd forgotten about, is you can figure out who the good students are in a class, right, Kim? I mean, you see who's posting,
True,
and they can be the
true.
ones that you reach out to and form a cohort if you want to do something extra. Well, this has been a marvelous conversation. It is so wonderful to be with a former student who's been so successful and really has become an excellent writer in her own right. And I would like us to end if you could possibly give us your top three takeaways about writing.
I'd like to also kind of say that this has been such an honor and a privilege to do this podcast with you. Like, look, I'm not trying to brown nose, but honestly, I promise you have been the best teacher that I've ever had because you were passionate about making sure that we didn't fail. And I know that there are other people that can relate to that. For me, you made sure I was a priority and that you didn't let me fail. And for that, I am so grateful. I am so appreciative. And also because of that work, because of the work you put in and because of the passion, I didn't fail. And by the time I got to the last English class, I went into that class with a different level of confidence than I did when I started, when my classes were online. So for that, I want to say thank you. Thank you for you and Sophie. And thank you for, again, this opportunity. And I will give you my takeaways. So my top 3 takeaways about writing is to thoroughly research the data of the subject that you're writing about. It will benefit you that you have all of your ducks lined in a row. And even if it's not all put together right, put it down. Just put it down. Put it down the way you interpret it, and let your teacher or let your professor. I don't necessarily want to say criticism in a negative way, but let them give you feedback how it can be presented differently. Secondly, be sure that you don't overthink it. I am a huge overthinker. And sometimes when I overthink, I veer off subject. I may start right where it needs to be, and as I overthink it, I'll veer off and I'll go off subject. And it's like, wait a minute, that was way, way, way too much. And then it just stopped making sense at some point. And so, in the words of Nike, just do it. Yeah. And nothing truly beats a fail but a try. If you don't try it, you've already defeated yourself. And in the words of Sophie again, yes, you can. Yes, you can write an essay. You just put your work in. And lastly, be mindful of your audience and how they would relay the information or interpret the information that you are presenting to them. You have to understand when you're writing the audience that you're presenting to and how they would read it. So if you flip that, if you were listening to it as a reader, can you follow the information that they're giving you from the intro to the closing? In the beginning, do we understand? Do we know where you're going with this? Do we know the topic? And in the middle, the cream between the sandwich or the cream between the cookie, do we understand all the details that support the topic that you're discussing? And at the end, have I given you what this was supposed to be about, the conclusion of this? And so that would be my final takeaway, just be mindful of your audience.
Well, those are marvelous takeaways. And I have to say to you, that compliment really meant a lot to me. There's nothing better than connecting back up with a former student and seeing that they're just completely and utterly launched beyond where you started with them. And I also want to say that you are so inspiring to all the other writers out there who are on the journey of writing. So thank you so much for this marvelous conversation.
You're welcome, and thank you as well.
All right, well, Sophie, that's a wrap.
Bye, Sophie.